no comment about.
Well, it's nice to meet everyone. I'm amazed that there's so many people here on such a beautiful day. But Marx is interesting, I guess. So I wonder, maybe we could actually just start by, should we just go around and say what our names are? And actually, I have one question, which is, how many people have read on the Jewish question? Okay, so very, very few people. Okay, so I'll try to read a passage as well so that we have something to use to talk about. Maybe if we're too large to all use our names, but maybe people can say who they are as they start speaking up. I will try to talk for just, maybe about 20 to 30 minutes at most, and then we really could just have a conversation about how maybe Marxist discussions and the Jewish questions impact some of the conversations we're having right now. When Philip invited me to do one of the Marxathons, I proposed one term, and he said, oh no, someone's already doing that. And so then I said, well, my favorite essay in Marx is the Jewish question. So that's how we got here. And one of the reasons, one of the things I think that's important to do is to think about what it means to turn to this text at this particular moment. As I'll talk about in a moment, the core of the Jewish question is a question that Marx is addressing about the limits and possibilities of emancipation, and particularly the limits and possibilities of emancipation through the state, the demand for emancipation through the political state. In many ways, that question has only reverberated in our time as more and more groups who have been in different ways denied identity in society or have been marginalized in society's sense of identity. It's a sense of itself. We're in gay cities, so we could use homosexuality as an example, but trans bodies, trans peoples, various racialized communities, immigrant communities, and so forth, as all of the different groups who have constituted U.S. society but have been denied the meaning of society and the identity of membership and of what it means to be, for example, American in our context. They have turned to various forms of social movements that have demanded, in different ways, an address from the state. And in many ways, the demand to handle and deal with marginalization and social oppression through demanding rights from the state has been one of the dominant ways social movements have imagined themselves throughout the 20th century into our present. So it's useful to go back to Marx's own thinking about this question of what does it mean to address the state for emancipation, and two, what kind of emancipation does one get when you desire political emancipation? And that is going to be the core of Marx's discussion, this question of what kind of emancipation is political emancipation. So let me just give you a bit of the context of the actual essay itself. The essay was written in, I think, 1843 or 1842. This is part of the Early Marx, and we can talk about that in a minute. It was written as a response to the radical Hegelian theologian Bruno Bauer, B-A-U-E-R, who was addressing a kind of very, not unlike our own, fragmented radical movement in Germany. The milieu of Bauer's essay was engaging with Jewish radicals who were in part arguing for, and not just Jewish radicals, but Jewish reformers, in fact, broadly, who were arguing for political rights from the Christian state. And these were oftentimes mostly figured as negative rights, rights of freedom to practice religion, for example, but also equal rights of membership in society, so forth. Up until this time in Germany, Jewish communities are regulated not through equal rights in the state, but through what Marx was calling and Bauer calls a series of privileges that are bestowed. A lot like, for example, how undocumented people live in the U.S. You have the privilege of having a driver's license. You have the privilege of day labor and so forth, but you're not fully vested with rights. So it's in this context that Bruno Bauer responds to the reformist Jewish movement and says to them, you want rights in the Christian state, and you are seeking rights for yourself, and you're asking all of the radical left to join you in your particularistic desire for rights. It's like asking, for example, gays and lesbians asking the trade unions and the labor left to participate in their rights to sexuality and sexual freedom, decriminalization of sodomy, for example, at the time. So in a very similar way, he's saying you guys are asking for your rights, but why should we listen? Because you're asking for rights for yourself and not for the whole of society. And what you're actually asking for are Jewish rights to be a participant in the Christian state, but you haven't undone everyone's subjection to the authority of the Christian state itself. And so for Bauer, he sort of says, the problem with demanding particularistic rights or group rights, that's language we might use today. The problem of demanding group rights like Jewish rights is that it leaves intact the character of the state. In other words, it's a kind of inclusionary politics, and that we should not participate in those kinds of coalitions, but only movements that argue for a absolute transformation and ending of the state as we know it. That it would be a collective emancipation, is the only movement we should have coalitions around. So Bauer says to them, if you're willing to give up your Jewishness and demand the rights of all secular people to the secular state, we will participate. We will not support Jewish rights, emancipatory rights, because, he says, those are just the continuation of religious rights. And if you demand the right of religiosity, then what is wrong with the state demanding its own right to be a Christian state? So only if you can participate in a broad conception of universal change, or universal rights, that would affect everyone, can your rights also be transformed. And so that's sort of Bauer's argument, is that what we need is not more rights for minoritized groups like Jews in this moment, but what we need is an abolition of the religious state itself, and the transformation of the state into a secular state. And this was very much an active possibility, as Marx and Bauer are both noting, in the period that they're writing, because two secular states have just emerged in Western society. One, of course, is the French state, which is a constitutional state with still a Christian character, so it's a partial secular state. And Marx will talk about the Universal Declarations of Rights of Man through it. But the one that is, according to Marx, a truly secular state that has abolished any religious character to its own state is the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution. And in the U.S., for the first time, European society has constructed a non-religious state. It's for the first time European society has discovered what we might think of as universal human rights and a form of state that is predicated upon human community, or what makes us, what we all share as humans, rather than various forms of religious authority. Now, what Marx does is he turns to, in responding to Bauer, Bauer's argument basically is saying, look, what we need to do is make all of Europe into America. We need to make all the other European states into secular states. And we need to get rid of the religious character of the state itself. And part of Bauer's argument about getting rid of the religious character of the state itself is that if you abolish the religious character of the state, you also enable people to see their true identities as fellow peoples, as part of a shared human community. That religiosity it continues to divide what we share, and that it's only a state that's predicated upon what is universally true that can allow all citizens to see their own universality and connect with each other on those horizontal relations of being part of the human together, rather than in these religious divisions. I'm Christian and you're Jewish, or I'm Hindu and you're Muslim, etc. You see yourself as actually part of the human community. Now, Marx says that's an interesting concept, but look what's happening in the United States. What's happening in the United States in the period that Marx is thinking, and this is in the 1830s, is very fascinating because the U.S. is going through massive religious revivalisms. Right? There are these are like circus shows. They're traveling all across the United States, yeah? And Marx actually says, he's actually quoting Beaumont. Beaumont is a French intellectual who's coming to the United States as a kind of a observer of this new kind of experiment in American democracy. And he says, Beaumont says, oh my God, America is so odd and paradoxical because when the businessman fails, he becomes a preacher. And when the preacher is really doing his job and speaking to God, he's an excellent businessman. Because he is going around and seeing all of these forms. There's all these kinds of religious revivalisms that are going on. And so, in a way, Marx says, there's a paradox here, which is, why is it that the state that appears to be most secular, the state that appears to have finally been predicated not upon whether you're Christian or part of this or that religious community, but really a state that's predicated upon what makes us all humans, why is it that that country is the one that is having religiosity at testosterone levels? Yeah, that is just that in which what it means to be American is in part to have these vital practices of your religious identity in the public sphere. Not just, kind of quiet, private religiosity, but just this absolutely durative kind of intense forms of religious community and religious life. So Marx is kind of using that historical paradox a moment to walk into a discussion that he's going to have about the so-called Jewish question. What I think is really interesting about just the phrasing of the essay itself is that we already know we're dealing with some kind of logic that secretly affirms one system of society and is having to figure out how to manage the demands of an excluded member of that society as they want in. So, in other words, the essay itself is on the Jewish question. It's not, for example, the essay could have been, the whole of German society could have written the essay that could have had this whole conversation about Jewish inclusion in the state as something like on the German question. But that's not how they're thinking, right? The German question is not the problem. The problem is the Jewish question. And you're going to see this that's probably my phone. You're going to see this over and over again. So for example, another essay that we could have paired with this essay that would have worked really well, if we had time, is W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 essay called The Souls of Black Folk. And if you recall that, if you know that book, and if you haven't, you should read it, you'll love it. It's incredible, overlap with Marx's account here. But in Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, he's writing in 1903. He's writing just after the 30 years into the emancipation, 40 years into the emancipation of African Americans as former enslaved people as citizens. And he says, and he's like going to all of these, he's a northern intellectual, he's in DC and in New York, and he's a scholar, so he's in academic communities, and he's going to all of these very scholarly conversations and all of these middle class households and so on. And he says, on the tip of everyone's tongues are this and that problem about post-emancipation America. What do we do with the crime problem? What do we do with rampant immorality? What do we do with people just walking away from jobs when they feel like it? Their laziness, in other words. And he says these are all liberals. And he says, and really what they're asking me all the time is, how does it feel to be a question? And of course, the question for Du Bois is the Negro question. That the United States, at the moment that African Americans gain political emancipation, the whole conversation becomes, how do we deal with the Negro question, right? So, and you can think similarly about the ways, for example, when women demand suffrage in the 19th century, it's not a conversation about the universal right to vote, it's a conversation about the woman question. Right? So just the structure of the question is part of the problem. And that will be one of the things that both Bauer and Marx will critique. They'll say, look, this is Bauer's point. He's saying, you don't want to be a question. You don't want it to be the Jewish question or the Negro question or the woman question. You want to show that the question is preserving somebody else's majoritarianism. And so what you want to do is get rid of the question and ask a different question. And so for Bauer, that different question is secularism, a universal secular state based upon human emancipation. Now, we'll talk about how, political emancipation. We'll talk about how Marx addresses this in a moment, but I wanted to just situate, before I can quote something from Marx, where this fits into Marx' oeuvre. So this is part of the early Marx. Much of the early Marx, all of these writings, this one was actually published in the Deutsches Französische Jahrbuch, which was a kind, it only had one issue, but it's like a viewpoint magazine. It was a very, very vital magazine for an active left in Germany at the time, where these questions got debated. But most of the writings of this earlier period of Marx were actually lost until the 1960s. And they weren't, most of them were not published until Marx was long gone. And many of them were rediscovered in the 60s. And they actually vitalized a new form of Marxist criticism. Because in this earlier period, Marx is very different than the late Marx. Many of the people who love Capital hate these texts, for example. They find these texts to be immature. They find these texts to be unscientific. They find these texts to be, in some ways, too involved in what many would call the superstructure, too involved in the world of politics and the law and cultural conflicts, and not enough in the science of economy. And so these are in many ways the lost Marx that has been rehabilitated since the 1960s. And in some ways, as we read them, we are all marked by the ways that they came back into society, which again is through the 60s social movement and its impact, particularly on French intellectuals that we then inherit in the US. Talk about that separately if you want. But what I do want to say about this early period of Marx is at this period, in many ways, really enchanted by ethnography and anthropology. And in fact, religious anthropology is going to be a very central place where he learns a lot of what he's going to do with the Jewish question. And I'll talk about that momentarily. But for Marx, the core of historical materialism is the belief that history is always the history of the social production of the necessities of life. So unlike liberal histories, which are most oftentimes histories of great ideas, histories of transformations in consciousness. So for example, a liberal history would be a history of how we got the French Constitution. It would be a history of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton and all of the different intellectuals who created our liberal doctrines. And it would be a history of their ideas, in a sense, a history of their thoughts. Now, against these conceptions of histories for Marx, history was always a history first and foremost of the social production of life. And what is very important about that conception of history is the concept of the social. So for Marx, the core of historical materialism is that there is no form of making and sustaining life that doesn't require social relations. Bless you.
Sorry.
No problem. That doesn't require social relations. And so the elementary social form for Marx is the relations between men and women as the sexual relation that produces life itself. So that's his first example. He says, look, what it means to have life is that you are not in charge of your life, which is how the liberals believe it, but that you, through a relationship, have been produced. So men can only produce life through women and vice versa. And so all life is the accomplishment of a social dynamic. And what history is for Marx, and this is what the historical of materialism part is, what history is for Marx is how those social relations are organized. So, for example, in the case again of sexual reproduction, the actual making of life itself is only possible in a social relation. Now we're in an interesting moment, Elise works on this so she can talk about this, we're in an interesting moment where people can commodify these things, so you believe that you can make life without another human being, but only if you believe the trick of the commodity. But for the most part, up until we had alienable sperm and surrogacy and so forth, all life required a social relation. And whatever was the form that relation took was the form of that society's history. So if those social relations, for example, were patriarchal, then the production of life happened under patriarchy. If those social relations were matriarchal, then the production of life happened under matriarchy. But for Marx also, these elementary social organizations keep on expanding in more complexity, and it's their expansion into higher levels of complexity that is the history, that is history itself. So, so life goes from in Marx, the account is it's stagist only because he's just trying to give you an example of how this works. He doesn't necessarily believe this. But he basically says, look, life goes from the relations between men and women in the production of human life itself. Then they move out into the relations of the household, in which you have multiple different members of the household. You have, for example, in the Roman household, slaves, you have women, you have children, you have the whole world of the social production of life necessities, the oikos. And the oikos, which is the Greek word for household, is a really good example of this because it's also the term that we get for economy. So the household is actually the place in which you learn to manage the social relations needed to survive through a year, right? So an economy of household is like Do we have enough grains for us to get through winter? And all of those relations, those social forms that form a society that's going to produce the oikos, is again, social organization. So for Marx, historical materialism is the history of the changes in the social production of the necessities for the maintenance of life. In many ways, all of society's social forms come from these social productions of life. So feudalism, for example, in Marx's account, comes up with a conception of property. It's a moral economy that corresponds to feudalist modes of producing life's necessities. And what is unique about capitalism, or what is unique about modernity's emergence, is that a new system of production is created for the maintenance and development of social life. And that system of production is, of course, the industrial mode of production. But that is just one system of production for the production of life's necessities. Yeah, and for Marx, all of the social forms that come into existence are only there because they enable a particular way of producing life. So in the case of our societies, in the case of capitalist societies, industrial modes of production, it's the set of property relations that allow for the industrial mode of production that organizes the social forms that we live under and experience. Yeah. So in other words, in this account of Marxism, he hasn't discovered value yet. Doesn't know what it is. He only has discovered this idea of historical materialism, that the system of the production of life's necessities will produce the social forms necessary for that system of production. And it's really in this context that he's writing the Jewish question. Now, the other thing that Marx is learning from is from religious anthropology in this period. And and Bauer is a part of this kind of radical anthropology of religion theology. And for all of them, what they believe at this particular moment, and Marx's idea of commodity fetishism will come from his reading of this religious anthropology as well, but he doesn't have it yet. But what he does have is that these anthropologists all say, look, religiosity is a ruse. Like why? So modernity is all about people sort of kind of breaking with the fetters of backwardness and learning your true emancipation, your true freedom, your real human identity. And for them, what they saw is that religion is just another way in which people misrecognized life's necessities. So let me clarify that for a second. So in other words, what religion was for these groups of anthropologists is they said everyone worships God. And they have a whole set of rules that they put forms of obedience and forms of duty, and that they experience because of their belief in God. But for these anthropologists, what God was merely the externalized, imaginary experience of the social community. So again, if you think about a system of production, we all think that we walk in the world as individual beings. But actually, the only way we will be sustained is if we're in relations with one another. And what religion was for these people was just the alienated expression of those relationships. So everyone put their collective will towards this thing called God. And it was that collective will called God that they obeyed. And through obeying or being obedient to that collective will, they had community. And through community, they were able to produce the social necessities of life. So for these thinkers, religion itself was an alienated moment in human consciousness. Religion was you still did not know that what made you possible was your relationship to others. That what made you possible was not that you were in a vertical relationship with kings and vassals and serfs and so forth, but that you were in horizontal relations with others. And the only evidence that people, the only version of that horizontality was the shared belief in God. And so for this cohort, what they all saw was that religiosity was itself an alienated expression of our actual communal wholeness. That if we could actually see that we were in a shared system of production, we would no longer need God. Because we would see that it's our community that creates our general will and not an external authority that creates our general will. So that's a kind of the context of this moment. Now, Marx is interesting in how he comes into this conversation because he makes a few points, and I've already spoken too much, so I'll try to be quick. He makes a few points. He says, one, he says, he looks at the European Christian state, and he looks at what happens in the United States, and what's happening particularly before in France, and he says, one of the things that we have to know is that the secular state is actually still an outgrowth of the European Christian state. It's not really secular. It's not really secular, meaning it hasn't lost its European Christian character. All it's done is transformed, because remember, he's an anthropologist at this moment, right? So what it means to have a Christian God is that you live in Christian society, right? And you live in all of the hierarchies and authorities of Christian society, including, for example, how Christianity sees Jews. So what he says is, first and foremost, secular society, and this I think is something very important if we think about contemporary Islamophobia, secular society is not actually non-Christian. It's just Christian society rationalized into secular concepts. And the best expression of this is that under Christianity emerges the concept of private belief, or belief itself, so that religiosity is in the space of belief, and not necessarily, you can experience religiosity while still leading a secular life. So you can, do all kinds of things, even though, for example, Puritans are an interesting example in Weber's work because he really is thinking about their whole experience of Christianity. But in this example, he's sort of saying, look, you can lead very profane lives, but if you have belief, you're still Christian. And so this Christian concept of belief becomes very central because it's what gets secularized as private rights. So the secular state that you and I know is a state that hasn't released itself from Christianity. It's generalized the Christian structure of religion upon everyone. So if you have a religious identity that can be translated into belief, you're going to be fine under a secular state. But if your religious identity exceeds the space of belief and goes into domains of social practice, you're going to start seeing the breakdown of the secular state. So a great example of this, that's so easy, since Elise and I teach at UW, is how they have to handle Jewish holidays, right? Jewish holidays are the one moment where you can't say that there's something called belief that is also a set of social practices in communities and relations and families, right? And so all of a sudden there's a crisis because religion, how are we going to recognize these Jewish holidays? If we give Jews holidays, then we have to give Muslims holidays, and we give Indian holidays, right? And so, but there was such a political movement around this, such an effort internal, that they don't give you Muslim holidays and Christian and Indian holidays, but they make a Jewish exception, right? And that's the first thing that Marx says. He says the secular state is really just the Christian state hiding through rational structures. And those structures break down the second you break from Christian conceptions of society. So the second you can't make your religiosity into belief, and it's going to connect you to social production, it's going to connect to all these things, this whole edifice will break down. The second thing he says that's really, really rich and interesting in this is he says that why the United States is so religious is because the function of the state is to grant membership in a political community, and that political community is really only the structure of collectivity that validates what he calls individuality or egoistic life. So he says the irony about the secular state is that it says that we're all equal politically because it believes we're all different in our particularity. So it actually promotes our differences. Funny.
They don't like this idea.
I know. It's like they're running.
They're moving the SWAT team into position.
Feels a lot like Jurassic Park or something. But so what he says is he says, look, the thing about the secular state is that its function at the end of the day is to protect egoistic man. It's to protect the flourishing of private life or private differences in civil society. And so, in fact, for him, it is precisely the moment that you see universal human equality that you're going to see an explosion of people who are going to express that human equality as their individual egoistic identities. Yeah? So the more you claim the universal, the more you're going to see people claiming egoistic identities. And so this is going to be another reason why the secular state cannot be the solution to the so-called Jewish problem. Yeah. So think about it. Think about it. In the United States, it's a really good, a very easy example. The second, for example, so we have the religious example of revivalism. How do people know that they are equal to, for example, the elites in the urban areas? They're able to express their egoistic identities through religious freedom, right? Because if you're saying, look, you who are poor and in the rural sector are equal to somebody who is a baron in Massachusetts, for example, what is that equality? It incentivizes you to want to express your equality as your right to egoistic life as well. So for Marx, he says, the problem of liberal democracy is that universal freedom is the freedom not to be with others, but the freedom to be egoistic man against one another.
What do you mean by egoistic life?
Yeah. So for him, he really means like the first right is, for example, the right to accumulate, like property rights, right? The rights to better your own conditions and to grow your own wealth, for example. And under liberal democracy, these rights are reduced to the rights of the individual. And so it is the right of individuals to be in competition with one another that is protected by the universal right of property. So in other words, we all have rights to the human. We all get to claim that we are equally human, that my body is mine and your body is yours. But we do that in order to be able to engage in competition with one another. And so we're constantly, when I get the same right as you, under liberalism and under capitalism, what that same right really trains me to do is to look at you as a competitive other, right? So how can I exchange with you in a way that's advantageous to me, for example? So rather than giving us, for example, experiences of what makes us communal, it gives us an experience of the communal as the universal right of competition. And so what ends up happening is the first country, the first European country that gives us broad universal rights or broad civil rights, give us the right to treat one another as competitive others, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing, just to add on this, which struck me when I read it again, giving people the same rights is treated under liberalism as giving them the same power. And what Marx, this is a beautiful paragraph, so if I could just do this. He says, if the state, as state for example, abolishes private property, man proclaims private property is overcome politically once he abolishes the property qualification for active and passive voting, as has been done in many North American states. So a man named Hamilton, now Alexander, says the great majority of the people have gained a victory over property owners and financial wealth. Is not private property legally abolished, Marx asks, when the have-nots come to legislate for the haves? The property qualification is the last political form for recognizing private property. Yet, he begins in the next paragraph, the political annulment of private property not only does not abolish it, but even presupposes it. The state abolishes distinctions of birth, rank, education, and occupation in its fashion when it declares them to be non-political distinction, when it proclaims that every member of the community, me and Jeff Bezos, can equally vote, participate in popular sovereignty without regard to these distinctions, and when it deals with all elements of the actual life of the nation from the standpoint of the state. Nevertheless, the state permits private property, education, and occupation to act and manifest their particular nature as private property, education, and occupation. In other words, the power continues to exist and sway what goes on. And then he calls liberalism's notion that the political life of the citizen is heaven. You know, we're all equal in heaven, but in the state, in this kind of egoistic thing of competition, some people have amassed more property, are exerting more force over, in fact, what will happen.
Yeah.
So it's a brilliant analysis of liberalism, you know, in just these 2 pages, I think.
Yeah, I would say the one thing I would say is just to go on that is that in this essay, the biggest, I think the most powerful and important point that Marx makes is he says that at the core of liberal democracy is a fundamental contradiction, which is that the rights of man will come to contradict the rights of another man. Right? Under liberalism, when you distribute rights universally to everyone, somebody's right is going to contradict with another person's right. And it is a historical struggle that determines how that relationship is going to be managed. So, for example, in the United States, we have a really good example of this in the Dred Scott decision, where in the 1832 decision of Dred Scott, the problem was whether the rights of a black man to claim membership in the state, in the free soil, in Jusali, how to handle that claim of rights with the right of the slave owner to claim his property and his value contractually. And when those 2 rights came into conflict, Justice Taney had to make a decision, and he said, look, there are no rights that the white man, there are no rights that the black man possesses that the white man must respect. So at that moment, you see the contradiction of liberalism laid out clearly as a racial contradiction, and this is Marx's point, this is going to come up all the time. And that how we resolve that contradiction produces the system of social difference we live in. It's what's going to produce race, it's what's going to produce white supremacy, it's going to produce, because these rights are always going to come into conflict. And the how that line moves is only through historical struggle. There is no way. And so one of the things he says that's really great to go on the Amazon thing, and this is also my last thing, that he says, the problem with getting emancipation in the state is that you can only take it as far as it continues to allow for the functioning of civil society. You can't use the state, unless you try to do a different kind of movement, to push those rights beyond the limits that are given in civil society. So he says, so an example he gives are taxes, which I think is great because of this Amazon thing. He says, look, you can go to you can make a movement to the state, and you can demand forms of emancipation or forms of rights. So, for example, homeless people demanding rights. Yeah, but if you seek emancipation for the state will only give you those rights to the degree that it's going to change property laws a little bit. It's going to tax the rich a bit more. It's going to give us $500 million for housing. Not a bad thing. But what he's trying to reinforce over and over again is that social movements that address the state as the source of their emancipation will always come to be limited by the degree to which the state is, as Philip was saying, always also protecting the structure of civil society. So unless you can change the structure of civil society, property relations, relations, for example, racial relations, gendered relations, etc., you're not going to be able to do more than change the share of the pie itself. And I think that was one of his most important insights. And so we could talk, like for example, I'll just give an example. I think something like Black Lives Matter is a very interesting use of this. Part of the problem that we're in is that we don't know how to make political movements without the language of rights. That is our crisis, right? Liberalism is so complete and so total, we're all so westernized, that we don't even have a way to speak about social change or demanding social transformation or demanding changes in power without using the very language that Marx is critiquing as ultimately going to restrict us. But if you can use the language as Black Lives Matter does, not to seek emancipation in the state, but, for example, as they do, to seek an undoing of the state itself, undoing the repressive force of the state, yeah, then you're starting to use rights in a way that was unimagined by liberalism. So, and I think feminist movements have done this, that we have all kinds of examples. But when you get Marx's critique, you actually can see what the difference is between what people call a reformist agenda, which wants rights from the state, and agendas that are radical that use the language of rights, but actually seek to undo this bind between the state and our society. And in that undoing, something more radical can happen. I'll stop there. And
I had a thought a while ago, and it only relates to a small part of what you were saying, so apologies for that. But I hadn't read the Marx essay. I think his point about the development of private conscience and interiority, and I would say the Protestant Reformation more than Catholic, is connected or is the progenitor of private rights, state rights and property rights and etc. So yeah, I'm not sure how that applies to Catholicism, though, where ritual and community is much more important.
Yeah.
But beyond that, you were talking about, of course, the revival fallback position, right? but in this church, she met a lot of black people, and not just that. I guess my point was, people, I think, go to these churches not just to sort of assert their equality with the elites, but also for community that is lacking, that's totally lacking now.
Yeah.
I mean, in the United States. I don't know about in 1830 so much, but now, what she had for friends, what she had for a support group, what she had for people to come to her when she was ill, was this church. and some of whom were black. And she became friends with some of these people. I mean, I'm as distant from Pentecostal beliefs as you could possibly imagine, but I see both the need for that kind of community and the way that desperate and misguided as it isn't entirely bad.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that, well, that also relates to, you talk about like this language of rights versus, I was thinking about in the feminist context, like this idea of care and like this kind of more of a sort of organization outside of the state. I mean, I live in the South, so religion is very important to some, Southern culture, and I see that just through daily experiences of, it is organized a lot through religion, but also radical feminist organizing. This idea of care, I think, is important and sort of subverts some of this idea of seeking, going to the state for, it seems in some ways a kind of opposition.
When you speak of going to the state, what rights talk goes to is the judicial system. It's the judicialization of what would be politics. So I would read it a little differently from Chandan. I wouldn't call what we have liberal democracy. I would call it liberalism, pure, and with no democracy, essentially, or not even aspirations toward it. I think what's interesting about the community experiences you talk about is even within the strictures of this particular religion, that sort of thirst for some kind of equality and democracy within and care for one another, which they don't get from the liberal state, can be created in both, anarcho left communes and even in
even like
evangelical.
In like recently, and I don't know how related this is, but like people who go to the internet or whatever to raise money for cancer, like this like
or Red Bay.
Sort of like exactly, like because there's no this complete vacancy there. So I don't know. I mean, and that's of course horrible in its own way, but I think there's a kind of self-organization.
But it's an attempt to fill a void.
That
we are not getting through the absence of a democratic community and a liberal community, which is a contractual community. All the myths of liberalism from political theory, which starts in this, about the time of the birth of capitalism, or a bunch of people are in the state of nature. They agree to form a society in one way or another, and they can withdraw from it if they like, because the individual precedes society. It's not the Aristotelian man is a political animal or something like that. So I really think that what we're looking for on the left is to get rid of this use of rights talk to look for what we're, because we are handing it off to the Supreme Court or the Constitution, and talk about those broad democratic majorities from below, democratic power, and how one frames that,
Actually, I wanted to ask, I'm sorry. I was just going to say something. You said something very provocative last week. I think it was you, in the Friday night session about taking pleasure in loss. And I thought actually this is maybe quite a good moment to ask you to expound upon that, because it's maybe about giving up the egoistic man or person or human, whatever, egoistic man.
Absolutely.
Is that related to what we're talking
Absolutely.
about?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think it's what you're saying about care as an alternative. But I mean, I think, just to say that very quickly, one of the reasons that this early Marx work is so interesting to so many people, that's so different than the later Marx, is in the early Marx, he really is thinking about what it means that, how much work we have to do to reshape our subjectivities. And he gives up the question of subjectivity entirely in the late Marx. In the late Marx, it's all about what you do with the rationality of capital, how you can turn the rationality of capital for socialist ends. But in the early Marx, this is where he's actually saying what capitalism, the version of capitalism that he's thinking of here, what capitalism is the colonization of collective life itself and the remaking of collective life in its own units of interest. So it's not, so for example, like religious communities, It's not that you can't be sub-communities within communities. It's that sub-community, all these communities are seen as individuals getting together and becoming a community. So the unit of the individual is already the basic unit of community. And once you have that, you're in kind of liberal capitalist rationality. And so what Marx can do in this essay that he can't do later because this is what he calls species being. In species being, you can actually think, maybe I'm not an individual. Maybe I am part of this species being, and that the I only exists in however the species is.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the species needs, for example, me to give my labor freely, I do that as my freedom in the species.
Right.
Where you're not even, it's not an I there, right, in the same way. And so that's what the Jewish question can do, and it's exactly against the liberal legalism that Philip is talking about.
Right.
And so that's, I think, the richness of this early work.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of question a little bit, like when you say Black Lives Matter is doing that. Like I absolutely respect and admire, but like, some things with, care that we're talking about in religion, like Sylvia Federici, who I am a huge fan of and love everything about.
Absolutely.
But she'll start talking about communities of care and self-management in ways that actually mirror the way that capital sloughs off the work into these voluntaristic groupings and collectivities. And so I feel like all these demands for something beyond rights discourse or something beyond what civil society can give you, they hit a structural limit, right? Where you kind of have to think about where, are we really living that, or are we volunteering all our little free time away? You know what I mean?
Yeah, individuals who are really just doing community.
Yeah, exactly. So how, and even with Black Lives Matter, I don't know if we can say as a whole, that it it is somehow going beyond that, not through any fault of the participants, but through those structural constraints.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that this is a battle inside movements.
Right.
And I think that's why I think this essay is helpful, is it can tell you what how our brains are habituated by rights.
Exactly.
And what it means to think beyond them, So one place I think that BLM, for example, has an opening is, recently, and Jordan works on this, so I hope he speaks up, but recently, Angela Davis, for example, had said that she didn't think Black Lives Matter could have gotten off the ground without the Palestinian movement in Gaza after the 2013 invasion. And you saw so many Palestinians making connections with Ferguson and with the experience of living under a military regime, but also the experience of living in an open prison. And I think that where that's a moment of species being, where you've encountered a group that you didn't think was your group, and you can't say we're both demanding human rights. What you can say is, what is our shared history that connects U.S. empire to the Israeli settler state and Zionism? What is the shared relations that produce the possibility of us seeing one another? And if we could do all of that, we're in species being. And something about U.S. blackness can be transformed by learning the histories of Palestinians. And that, I think, is species being. When your sense of self is transformed by the history of someone you can't see as just other nationalities, other rights bearers of another state, then you're in species being. And I do think that conversation is happening in some parts of BLM, and there's some parts that are very nationalist. And so I absolutely think you're right.
Can you talk a little bit more about, because I don't know this, about how Black Lives Matter is using the discourse of rights, but also somehow subverting it?
Jordan, do you want to say something? Jordan's written like 2 books on this. That's why I'm turning to it.
I mean, I'm not sure. Well, this is just really helpful. I've learned tons from the presentation. Thank you for this work. And, you know, all of your work, Chandan, I think helps us understand how kind of emancipatory movements in the past can get conscripted in the service of capitalism and empire. And it seems like it's a long dialogue between Marx that we're seeing the good fruit of today. But like, I mean, I think you can see some of the tensions and contradictions that Chandan's talking about in the Movement for Black Lives platform. Have you seen this?
This is their platform of what their demands are.
The internet,
Yeah.
So, I mean, on one hand, it's for, you know, things like they want to see an end to police violence, they want to see jobs. It's really pretty systematic. How many people have seen the, and so, you know, there's elements there that I think are in the way that Chandan's talking about. There's making language to address change that are not simply reformist, but they kind of exceed the capacities of the capitalist state, right? You know, that there's a kind of elementary platform for access to liberal democracy that the state can actually demand.
What's an example of something that exceeds the...
I mean,
because police reform is not, obviously.
Yeah.
Jobs, maybe, you know, I mean, you could put more money into training for African Americans. The state could satisfy, well, not successfully, but could try to satisfy that demand that way. So what's something that's completely beyond the state's ability to appropriate?
I don't think any of those things are beyond the state. Sounds like this person has something to say. I mean,
maybe there's one example since they borrowed from Palestine, or because they were influenced by Palestine, the Palestinian practice of al-Masha, which D. Paul Langton's architecture artist residency and Fred Moten have written about, where rather than appealing to the Israeli state for a land claim, Palestinians just continue to sort of like cultivate commonly held lands, and it actually makes it harder to expropriate them than if they were leveraging a specific legal claim or were sort of as a singular family unit inhabiting a piece of land permanently. Cycling through areas makes it more difficult because they're not adhering to the logic of the state in the first place. Their claim is in excess of it. So.
And let me give it, Elise, do you want to say?
I would just say, in some ways, there's such a simple answer, which is just the hashtag itself, which is, you know, Black Lives Matter, which is that I think there's an appeal to a version of the human which does not exist within the confines of the way in which the claim to entitlement is produced within the history of the U.S. state. And so, you know, to reconcile, I mean, this is the Du Boisian question, to reconcile blackness with humanity is actually outside of the state's, that's what we've learned, right?
And I mean,
the state's capacity.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, but it's, in some ways it's so simple. So the whole, and I think that's why saying that there's an internal division within the movement, it doesn't come down to the platform. It comes down to the take on what it means to make that appeal at all.
I think it was an extraordinarily effective slogan, particularly because it was quite obvious that when you saw visually, Black lives didn't matter. And the gap between that simple statement, that statement was in fact Black lives don't matter, even though it said Black lives matter. That's how people read it. I think when they, you know, observers who felt Gattungswesen, you know, a species being with others, looked at it. It's so obvious that they don't matter that, you know, here it's being said. So in a way, it's one of those things like the 1%, just that phrase, that opens up, it creates an opening in political discourse, you know, that more can go through, I think. So
I do think that there are, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so this is very complicated from the way Marx proceeds, as I understand it. First place, we were talking earlier, or at least Annie was talking earlier today, about shortening the working day. Now, you know, if you look at Marx's critique of the Goethe program, and it talks about we don't want wage labor. We want to transcend wage labor. We don't want to, but yet he is supporting a reform of shortening the working day.
Mm-hmm.
Marx was also supportive of electoral politics, and participating in electoral politics. Lenin was in a similar way supportive of being involved in that level of politics of the state, but yet in his April Theses talked about, we need to go beyond, that we need to have a revolution.
Yeah.
And so I think that these things ultimately, and maybe Marx wasn't thinking it in those terms at that time, he was only 24, I guess, but we need to talk about what the actual material, the actual historical moment, and what is possible within that historical moment, and what should people be doing. If there's a big movement for shortening the working day, then we should support that movement. And I think Marx would agree with that. And I'm curious to see what you think about these sort of, that it's not as clear as it seems to be in the way he writes the Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that everyone's bringing up is, in the Jewish question, there's a scholar named Ruth Wilson Gilmore who works a lot on prison-industrial complex and black social movements, and she comes up with this phrase called, which I think is what you're talking about, non-reformist reforms.
Precisely.
How do we participate in a reform movement that doesn't recapitulate what we would call political emancipation? And so I'll give you just a concrete example, in our time, which is affirmative action. So affirmative action, if you think about what happened in 64 and 68 as African Americans gaining civil rights, and you think of what that means as African Americans being able to participate in determining the the political community. So for the first time, African Americans get the right to vote in reality in the South. They get to participate in the institutions of society, like educational institutions, business, and so on. And in Marx's account, all of those civil rights are that you're being allowed to create the collective political community. Now, if that collective political community is a liberal democracy, you create it only to the degree that it upholds competition in civil society. And so in the case of affirmative action, some people think of affirmative action as trying to rectify past ills and trying to rethink meritocracy. And it's like, oh, you know what, it's not just test scores, it's also people's hardship, and we can calculate hardship, and we can connect it together, and we can get these people into those institutions. But if you're an anti-reformist reform movement, you think about affirmative action as undoing the white supremacy of the educational system. It's not how many people get in, it's how do we undo the white supremacy of the educational system. And undoing the white supremacy of the educational system might be ultimately open admissions, right? Like it can go anywhere, but that's the difference in the Marx account of what reform, when reform recreates the liberal political community, and when you could use a reform and push it to realize histories that liberal political community tries to suppress. Because his argument is the way Christian liberalism works, Christians had all the advantages and they secularized and they baked in their advantages. And so it's just like masculinity. Masculinity had all the advantages of liberalism and it's secularized, and so every time women, for example, deal with health, to go to ethics of care, you have to use it as personal rights. Think about the abortion debate. The whole abortion debate is because the system is skewed towards men, right? And so that's Marx's point, is that these secular systems are actually hiding a particular group's advantage and biased groups as well. And that it's only the reforms that can actually imagine our histories together and imagine what it means to actually share history and not to have it partitioned by rights, that we get somewhere. I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
Can I ask about the logic you mentioned that Marx specifies or doesn't? What's the formalism of that maneuver that gives people abstract citizenship, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And how does that relate to how developed civil society is today, rather than from Marx's time?
What do you mean by the last part?
Like, okay, for instance, I was at AAAS and I saw your
Yeah.
presentation with Black Lives Matter,
Oh, yeah.
and like his claim,
Yeah.
the guy's claim. I don't know how to just describe that further, who he was. But the sort of maneuver that he was claiming, the horizontal maneuvers that he was claiming in Missouri, rather than, just a rights claim to the state, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, right. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Because there's no formal recognition for feeling oppressed, or feeling jaded, or being disappointed politically.
A little confused. I didn't see that presentation, so I don't totally know.
No, you gave it.
Oh, you're talking about my presentation at AAAS.
I don't even recognize that.
I wasn't even in town that day.
Yeah. Let me think about what I was saying.
Saying, I am an other, like, around.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk later, because I have to think about it. Yeah. Elise?
Oh, well, thank you so much. So I came to hear Chandan because I wanted to learn how to teach this essay.
Oh.
And I just, in the Marx course, which some of you heard me discussing in the last, and Chandan's the other person that teaches that course, so that's great. I learned. Thank you. But here's my question. I think this opening that's created in the early Marx is so fascinating.
Yeah.
And it kind of it raises this question to me about what happens when we do the juxtaposition. What closes down when we move to capital and to the discussion of value. And, I experienced this in the last session, which I felt was a closing down of the possibilities in that text in a certain way. And I think that what you're suggesting is that there's a necessary juxtaposition of the old Marx, the early Marx, and the later Marx, that forces an interruption of the refusal of the earlier attention to the superstructure and to species being, and even to the utopian humanist impulses within that essay, because I think it's a utopian essay.
Yeah, it is.
In a really intensive way. So it's just, there's some really interesting questions about what it means to think it together, which for those of us that have been sitting in these rooms together today have actually been doing. So that we did chapter 25, which is the question of
General law of accumulation.
Yeah. So
no, it's true.
it's just a really interesting, it just raises some really interesting issues about politically where do we return and where do we get the grist for the activism that we might want to do, or the pedagogy that we might want to do, the kinds of messaging out of Marx into the world that we live in now that we want to do.
No, I think that's right. And I do think, the other thing that I think is a contradiction in this essay is that in this essay, what's great about this essay is that Marx doesn't have a base superstructure yet.
Right.
And that's what makes it so interesting. He can't go to an economism because he doesn't have a base superstructure division yet. But what is difficult about this essay is he is a humanist. So he still believes that what Europe has discovered is what the human really is. That there is something called the human that all of us on this planet share. And so for him, you can get rid of the state in part because we all share the capacity of humankind. But if the human doesn't, if that's a ruse, if now Marx still believes in that, but if that is not true, that there isn't something called a universal human that all of us share, then I think the question of what is the political form becomes vital again. So in other words, in this essay, Marx can get rid of sovereignty because we are all humans. But if you can't rely on this idea of the universal human that he has, then you really can't get rid of sovereignty. And then these questions of the state and of state power really come back. And people There are people, for example, who work on the Indian Ocean trade who are looking at overlapping sovereignties and other theories of sovereignty that don't come out of the Christian tradition of the Christian state that Marx is talking about. But this, I think, is a big problem, is Marx's solution presumes humanism, and if we can't presume that, then some of these problems really return.
Isn't it something that you need to
Sorry?
Sorry, mean by humanism?
Yeah. So Marx thinks that there is kind of an architecture that that describes all of us. For example, that it's easiest in use value. That's the easiest way I can give it. In Marx, there's exchange value and use value is all the things that are useful to you. For example, clothing is useful because you need it to go out into the world, like a coat. Food is useful because you need caloric intake, etc. But use value for Marx is still an abstraction because it's all the things the human being needs, and you and I are just examples of the human being. So for Marx, it's not like you have Chinese cuisine and Mexican cuisine and Italian. It's that you have to get 2,000 calories a day. And everybody needs 2,000 calories a day to survive. And once you can get into that level of abstraction, where I'm not Indian and you're not American, we're just 2,000 caloric and sort of beings needed, that is the human for Marx. And so for Marx...
So that's what you mean by humanism?
Exactly.
That fundamental idea.
Fundamental, and that's what sort of liberal rights is predicated upon. That you and I are abstractions of the human. And that my culture is just my particular expression of the human. And your culture is yours. But if you can't make that division, and you can't say, actually, you know what? This idea of humanism where everyone is 2,000 calories being of some sort, can end up producing all kinds of divisions still, then you're in trouble.
Well, maybe
That's
we
just species being.
Yeah.
That's the thing, that's species being, and he believes in it, but I don't know if it's possible.
Right.
But doesn't he believe in it to the end? Didn't he always believe in species?
Yeah, he holds on to this humanism. That's why he doesn't think we need a state in capital. And in a way, China is an example.
There's this early moment that's
Yes.
captured in this essay. That's kind of what I'm
Yes,
saying.
this early moment is interesting.
This early moment captures something that goes missing.
Yeah,
Right.
And it's the possibility of an acknowledgement of difference.
yeah.
So maybe there's a way to stop playing two Marxes off against each other and raise your hand for the one that you think you want to follow, whether it's the humanist young Marxist.
Well, I think Elise is saying you need both.
I'm saying you can't do that.
No, I'm going to talk about three Marxes.
Okay.
So I'm going to see if I
Marx
can...
Brothers.
So, Harpo, Chico, and Groucho. So, my notion is, and maybe I'm just trying to cast out the stuff I don't want to use and keep in the other. But my notion starts with Heinrich that it's an unfinished work. It's a project that we all collectively become Marx to use the elements that orient us towards the key questions and sort of finish and refine in notion with our political experience as we know it. The Marx I have no use for is the base superstructure Marx, the stages Marx, the locomotive of history Marx, the science of history. There's this follows this follows this. The three stages, that seems to me to be, you find that in so many 19th century thinkers like Auguste Comte or so forth, or Lewis Henry Morgan, the good one, that there are three stages, the kind of historicism that just seems so 19th century that's not me. So I don't go for that. Base superstructure is not something that Marx uses in Capital. I think he uses it one or two times. It's what I think what we're dealing with is what attracts us in the young Marx is precisely whatever it is that draws us into being indignant about injustice, as Chris Marker would say, in his movies. And whatever it is, call it species being, or don't have to mystify it as some kind of humanism with a capital H. There's something in those things that we do respond to, and we want to try to find a way to have it orient our political lives.
Yeah.
But I think the important point about this third Marx, who is one that I was only introduced to after the financial crisis and after I had passed retirement age, was that Mr. Marx went to England after making all sorts of depictions of capitalism before having ever seen it up close. And for some, I don't know, 30 years, whatever, he literally went to the library, he read these factory inspector reports. No one had ever, and all the theories of the English economists, no one had ever studied any social phenomenon in this degree ever. I mean, this is the beginning of social theory, it was the beginning of the history of technology. A lot of things just spring out of Marx's overcoat, as people say about Gogol. But what I would like to say is, what he's looking at in England is, what is this beast called capitalism? What's the model? What's in the engine room? How does it work? And he gets to the point that it is about MCM prime and it's about accumulation. You know, and it has all sorts of different instantiations in history, social formation. It has qualities of rebounding or rebuilding itself that we don't know and we're only finding out now. But I think rather than calling that model capitalocentric, or even finding it a distinctively Marxian method, isn't that like what science, basic science that we know does? You know, where it comes up, tries to go beyond the appearance and come up with a model of phenomenon, revise it if things don't work, go back and study. I mean, the man was notorious for saying, I can't write this now, Mr. Engels. I need to do some research about what just happened. I read in the paper for another 10 years. So we need that Marx and we need the early Marx. Yeah. We need that model of capitalism because that's the enemy. Yeah. And we need to know what it can't do, what people are asking it to do in the NGOs and the human rights thing. You know, they're sensitive to exploitation. They want an NGO to cure it. Yeah. You know, but capital will regenerate it in some way when the truth dies. So both understanding the critique of political economy, without calling it capitalocentric, and yet looking for the way we organize, way beyond Marx or Lenin or any of them, you know, to just look at what's happening now and where it's coming up and learn from how people are sort of organizing that collectivity that we want to replace liberal individualism.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is just that we can stop here. Is I think that this critique of humanism is very important because this was the problem of state socialism. Yeah. State socialism could imagine everyone as 2,000 caloric beings. Yeah? So it could move populations for a managed economy, and that was in the interest of justice. Right? And so even, for example, if you take climate change to go with what Philip is saying, you know, we're in a series of things where on the one hand, we need the rational abstraction of science to know whether temperatures are rising or falling, how much CO2 we can emit as a species, quote unquote. But when we look at who pays for what it means to reduce carbon footprint or what it means to reduce the temperature, it is population movement, it's indigenous people not being able to have sovereignty over waters and lands and streams, it's all of these, and those are the two Marx together. Yeah. You know, so in a way, this is the kind of richness, and I think, you know, one way to think about species being in a useful way is we have a teacher who used to call it this, is to demonumentalize species being. To imagine, demonumentalize it. So not to imagine that we are humans together, but in the small h, like, I think we're together, but I don't know our history yet. You know? And I can't presume I can know it until we start really, really getting into it. You know?
There's also the issue of just, you know, the major topic in so much of political theory of human nature. You know, when we talk about humanism, one of the most fundamental aspects of humanism is what is the nature of human nature, and he really emphasizes, I think, especially
thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.
In the later work, that human nature does not have any constant. It has no constants whatsoever. It's completely a product of the mode of production. You have a proletarian human nature, you have a communist human nature, you have a capitalist human nature, you have a feudalist human nature. So there is no, in some ways you could read Marx against Marx, I think, especially with respect to humanism, through that actual question of human nature.
Yeah.
And you